This week on Around the Coin, Brian Roemmele, Faisal Kahn, and Mike Townsend provide the blueprint for the mobile payment industry both in the United States and abroad. Around the Coin.
All right, guys, how's everyone doing today? We have a great show around the blueprint for mobile payments. We're going to be discussing what mobile payments look like outside the U.S., inside the U.S., and then where they're going to be headed in the future. Look at a few of the major players out there, what they're doing, but particularly what the opportunities are abroad and what mobile payments has in store. With that said, how are you guys doing? Brian, Faisal?
All right. Good morning. Doing fine.
So Faisal's tuning in from Pakistan, which gives us the unique opportunity to dig into his brain a little bit and learn what people are doing outside the U.S. I know Brian and I, both being in California, we share a little bit of the condensed claustrophobia of being only exposed to and seeing U.S. payments. So I think it'll be interesting to kind of pull Faisal's brain a little bit and learn there. But of course, contrast it with Brian and I's experience here in the States. With that said, we have a few different categories of mobile payments we can dive into. We have mobile payments, peer-to-peer, m-banking. But with that said, Faisal, do you want to start it off and sort of give a little intro / background?
More and more mobile payments that are emerging out in the developing nations, emerging markets, as we call them, they're more driven by either the telco or the bank because of the huge numbers that they have. They're not retail driven, for example, like in the US. The need is being addressed by the banking institutions or by the mobile carriers themselves or a combination thereof. So at this point in time, pretty much the emerging markets agree that the mobile wallet, however you want to shape it, with or without an offline card, what have you, will be your bank account for the years to come. The traditional bank account is not going to be holding its strength anymore because it requires a very different mindset and a very different ecosystem to operate in. With globalization coming across, with more mobility coming across, the mobile wallet is now at the forefront for banking services. So that means less physical visits to the bank branch, more physical visits to your local retail store or point of presence from where you could load or unload a wallet or cash in or cash out. Traditionally, we've seen that most of the mobile payments being deployed start with the very basic transaction set of branchless banking, i.e. your telephone number becomes your bank account number. You have to go into a branch or a very specific place to do a KYC once, and it becomes almost seamless to receive a payment or send a payment just by giving a number. And this works traditionally over the GSM channel, which is called the USSD channel. So that means you are not required to have a smartphone. So it's a text-based SMS kind of a service. You put the codes in, you give your transaction codes, and you send money. And that's what's been happening in Africa. It's been happening in Southeast Asia. It's been happening in South Asia. Huge markets that are coming on board. Are we at a stage yet to say that we have square equivalents? Now, when I say we could mean any country in the emerging markets. Are we at a stage where we have a wide adoption of mobile point of sale systems? Are we at a stage where we have absolutely, as Brian says, frictionless payments across, being able to send money from person A to person B in a very frictionless manner? No, we don't. No, we're not there yet. I think we are taking the good examples of PayPal, of Square, and other mobile application service providers or financial services providers from the US and Europe, and slowly juxtaposing it on our systems. It is still far away. We feel that the adoption rate is not high enough, especially for the merchants. We have a huge network in play, but the merchants are not yet ready to start accepting, MPOS or seamless peer-to-peer payments or even things like, the way Lyft is used, or Uber is used for paying taxi fare, etc. We're not there yet, but we are getting there slowly and slowly.
Why is that, by the way? Is it culturally?
Cash is still king. I'll grant you that. I think it's more. You have to look at our societies. You have a white collar. The pyramid on the very top is white collar. Then you have your blue collar. The definition of blue collar between emerging markets and, let's say, the definition of blue collar in, say, the US is inherently very different. Very, very different. So the person, the average blue collar in the US does have a smartphone. The average blue collar person in, let's say, India or Pakistan absolutely does not have a smartphone. Just by that differentiation, you can see that the transaction set cannot be juxtaposed, cannot be enforced. Do you understand?
I definitely get that. I have a bit of an insight, I think. One of the driving forces in the United States is the Steve Jobs effect. Prior to the iPhone and Steve's really incredible negotiation with the telcos, we would not be in the world we are today. The whole startup environment that we're familiar with over the last 8 years would generally not exist. What Steve did was he essentially took primary control from the telcos and into the hands of a manufacturer and a hardware and software manufacturer. That created the ecosystem.
I want to tell you something. You just said something so important. He took the control away. Not many people understand that part.
Yeah,
it is so important.
And so we also have this capital formation and startup culture because of that I am not seeing in a lot of parts of the world. There's pockets of it, and it's not because there's a lack of creativity. Some of the most creative payment ideas are coming from outside the United States. Unfortunately, they just don't have the ability to get capital formation, and there's still a bias to get somebody, to sit within miles of Sand Hill Road. And I understand that, but at some point that is going to change. And I think with Bitcoin and other things, that's changing rapidly. But I think that is one of the reasons why we see this. It's not just because I think of the technology of the handset in and of itself. I think that there's just too many entrenched existing players that are now primed for what happened in the United States, and they're saying, I don't want to be just dumb pipes. And that includes the bank, and that includes, the cellular providers, because banks are worried about becoming dumb pipes in the U.S., as Steve liked to call the phone companies. So what this means is the challenge is to build a revolutionary company outside the United States, especially in Faisal's part of the world, is going to be that much harder. And so the innovation is going to be, the high watermark is going to be much lower. And the adoption rate could be faster because these providers could essentially by fiat say, this is there's good and bad to that. I mean, the U.S. phone system grew because of the Bell company's control, but it also crushed creativity. And it wasn't until the dilution of the Bell system that we saw the explosion of creativity in the United States. And same thing is going to go true with, I think, a lot of these cellular providers in other parts of the world. But, if you look at Africa and M-Pesa, there's an example of a lot of existing rights holders working together to create something that's phenomenal. I think it is the perfect example of what can be done if the right people get together. And it's as low tech as it comes, but it's taken over most of North Africa.
But assuming everything equal, assuming all the technical capabilities are there from individual countries' perspectives, aside from culture, which is sort of hard to quantify and say why people wouldn't do it, maybe it's inherent lack of trust in the network and past things that have happened in that country. Is there anything technical that is sort of standing as a barrier in countries that don't have mobile payments or haven't really seen the adoption as we've seen in other parts of the world? I mean, is there any sort of, from a list of technologies that exist in the mobile payments, you have a lot of different options with, SMS or barcode or the bump payments or, NFC. But is there anything standing in the way, Faisal, that you see from the technological standpoint?
Absolutely. Quite a few things. I mean, it may not be technical, but first is access to capital. In the US, you can go take an idea, get it VC funded and push it out because your banking and your state laws allow you to push your financial services out in the payment space. In the rest of the world, that's not true. The rest of the world, payment space is governed and monopolized by the banks. So you would have to partner up with banks. There is no separate, money transmitter license that you can get out. Even though you're banking with the bank, but over here, the regulations are such that you would require majority share, bank co-branded, bank would take the risk, etc. So access to capital is definitely an issue. And, the only capital over here, the people who have the capital to drive a payment system are the banks and the cellular companies themselves. Then you look at things like, technically, what are we looking at? Nothing. There's nothing that's stopping you technically. M-Pesa is an example of a need. Technology was just an enabler. It just happens to be that we were using the GSM USSD channel.
Absolutely.
If we go back, the US is, I believe it's CDMA and TDMA, if I'm not mistaken. The GSM just came very recently to the US.
Yeah.
And I think you're still CDMA. I don't know if that's correct or not, but 5 years ago or maybe 8-9 years ago, if you had to send something or if you call someone, the calling party minutes were depleting. I mean, I had to pay just to receive a call. So those things, we never, the developing world never had those challenges or hurdles. The developing world's challenge has been, looking at a need, fulfilling it. They made it as cheap as possible, as economical as possible for the masses to get it. Now, if you look at M-Pesa, you'll probably see a rollout. On a per capita basis or a normalized basis, there's probably no comparison to that. Not even PayPal could compete on that front, on a normalized basis. But if you look at it on a global basis, well, what is it? 20 million, 30 million, 40 million? Well, big deal, But for that country, it's a huge number. I mean, if you look at the US and I were to ask, well, how many Bitcoin wallets in the US? I mean, I'm giving a very tangential example, but still. And as part of the online banking community, people who bank, how many people have Bitcoin wallets? You'd probably have a tough time answering that question. And you'd probably say, well, I think 1% or 2%.
It's a litlittle less than 1% according to my calculations.
Okay, so there you go. In Kenya, it's I think it's almost now 2/3 of Kenyans have it, or 1/3 of Kenyans have it.
Wow.
Well, M-Pesa or Bitcoin?
Bitcoin wallet.
Well, in a sense, everybody that uses M-Pesa does have access to Bitcoin now, and there is a tremendous growth in that country because of a relationship, unofficial maybe, with a Bitcoin wallet provider. So, the thing I think that's remarkable about M-Pesa is the level of veracity. We're looking at every age bracket using this system. You're looking at it touching to the 98th percentile of that country. So it shows that if the right solutions are created and the right problems are addressed, you can explode in use cases. It's not a problem. And here in the United States, you have mobile wallets that barely break a single digit, and there's billions of dollars behind it with direct investment and marketing.
The common denominator, in the U.S. is for lack of, there's a very mature payment system out there. There's no doubt about that. But outside the U.S., if I were to ask you, well, can you name me one payment system that is P2P in Europe? You cannot. If I were to ask you, can you name me one mobile payment system or mobile POS that's homogeneous all across Europe. You probably couldn't name one. I mean, so you see, the U.S. ecosystem is very different, very, very different, and it sort of identifies. It's identified by itself. It sets the standard in many, many ways, and literally, no pun intended, literally sets the standards. It raises the bar, and then it sees, well, but everyone who invests in the U.S. payment system is more or less happy with the U.S. Side of it, maybe extended up to Canada, and crossed upon to UK and perhaps Europe. But that's about it. I mean, no more. The rest of the world feels deprived of such. Why aren't they coming into my country? Why aren't they extending out this thing? So that's where the copying or the mimicking of those payment systems come into being. This is why people ask, well, do you have a Square clone in your? That's hence the word. Do you have a Square clone in your country? Do you have a Square-like service in your country? Do you have a Uber-like service in your country? Do you have a PayPal-like service in your country? So we stopped using the words like, do you have a mobile POS, swipe and read solution in your country? Do you have a ubiquitous application where you could pay a taxi or chauffeur-driven services for for pick and drop in your country?
Faisal, I think what we've learned from a number of these shows, and it's surprising to me, is the lack of vision of a lot of U.S. companies. I mean, we talked about Foursquare and how there is absolutely no feet on the ground converting all these check-ins and useful relationships with merchants. To me, that's just absolutely mind-blowing. It's the simplest thing to do as a startup. And Foursquare, I mean, you might argue it's not even a startup anymore, but these smaller companies or larger companies or VC-backed Silicon Valley-based companies or New York-based companies, I've covered them all. But, why are they not doing this? I've asked this question a lot of times.
Very few are.
Yeah.
Very few are. The one example that comes to mind again and again, if you talk about a US-based company, Silicon Valley funded, that chose the emerging markets as the market to operate in, is Zoom. Zoom specializes in cross-border money transfer. And because of the way it's structured, you need a party on the other end to send money to. And they've specialized US, India, US, Philippines, etc., and so forth. And that's how they're picking up their market. But that's because of their business model that was as such that they have to work with a remittance country. Barring Zoom, I honestly have a very hard time trying to understand where is another Silicon Valley example that has actually gone into emerging markets.
So is it Faisal, is the real problem here the fact that there's not an educational knowledge base behind the capital that gets invested into startups? For instance, there are some very smart venture capitalists in the Bay Area, but is there sort of a lack of those that will take risks because they have a knowledge of what payment systems look like outside the U.S.? I mean, it's hard for people to invest in things they don't know.
They're very smart people. They have access to resources. But in the greater scheme of things, if you look at a piece of paper which lists the market in natural order that you need to go to and extend out to, it would most likely be Canada. There would most likely be UK. There would most likely be Europe, countries in Europe. And then you would start, looking at countries like, let's say, China or India, and then the surrounding countries in those regions. But the natural progressive state of how we can expand into emerging markets is actually pretty low on the priority list, because they have a better chance of making and recouping their money by entering into the already developed markets, and where they don't have to spend a lot of money in regulation, where they don't have to spend a lot of money in learning the markets, where they don't have to spend a lot of money in educating, where the adoption rates could be much higher simply because of the levels of education, the penetration, the smartphone penetration, or how everyone is using mobile banking and mobile phones, etc. So they see a better return for their investment. I think it's the CFO that's making the decision, not the CEO in this aspect.
Interesting.
The bean counter, I would say, wins,
Yeah. And do you see, I wonder, one interesting aside is from living in Singapore, I've noticed that that country has a huge advantage in the fact that it's essentially grew very quickly, right? You look at the States and you see the huge infrastructure of highways, and you see sort of the urban sprawl, and that's because the country in some cities developed slowly. And there's big advantage in sort of being behind the curve in some countries, I would imagine, for payments, and then all of a sudden having all the technology available to you where you can really craft the best solution for all your people.
Yeah. I mean, in Singapore was perhaps one of the first countries where you could SMS and get a Coke. You know, if you look at Japan, if you look at Korea, South Korea, if you look at Hong Kong, the amount of automation there is in payments is mind-boggling. It's absolutely mind-boggling. I mean, I still go back and tease some of my American colleagues and say, well, hold on, guys. I mean, it takes 3 days for you to make a payment across from bank to bank. I mean, you know, your ACH system is so archaic. Yeah, but we're fixing it. Yeah, once you fix it, then we'll talk. But in other areas, of course, you have an advantage. But in countries like Singapore, because of the relatively small population, the very high densities, there's a very low percentage of blue-collar workers versus the white-collar workers, and it's got the best talent from all over the world. You see a very high adoption rate for payment systems that are native to that country. NFC took off way before in, let's say, Singapore and Hong Kong than it did in, let's say, better parts of Europe. In the US, I guess it's still struggling, and there's a huge debate if NFC is the technology or not. But in Korea, the way payments are done, the way ATMs are used, the way in Hong Kong, the way payments are done, in Singapore, they're way ahead in the game. Tokyo's way ahead in the game, although Tokyo's banking system does have a flaw or two. But payments over there are literally eons ahead with respect to perhaps any other country that I could cite.
I would agree, and the adoption of technology for technology's sake, a lot of us in the U.S. will look at it and say, well, they're going after NFC and, it's just to adopt the technology just because it's there. And that's a ridiculous notion. And it's a very biased notion. I mean, the failure of the NFC uptake in the United States had most to do with what you brought up, Mike and Faisal, before, is you have existing infrastructure and commitment to merchants. And you have the landowners, Visa and MasterCard, saying there's no benefit we're going to grant you to upgrade your equipment. We're not going to save your money. We're not going to do anything. And it already works great. But here's this new technology, and we want you to invest money into accepting it. This was early 2000s, late 1990s, and everybody thought NFC was going to take off. Not everybody, but a lot of people inside the industry. I knew that the incentives weren't there. So even though my colleagues were selling the heck out of NFC-based devices to unsuspecting merchants, the uptake was nearly zero. Now, can you change that? Well, it is going to change because of the target breach primarily. We're moving to EMV with and without PIN, and wireless EMV, which is really NFC by any other name, sort of a name game, and tokenization, which is in and of itself a technology. I wrote a piece about this on Quora about how I believe that tokenization is going to completely change every aspect of payments in the same way that Bitcoin and algorithmic currencies are. The tokenization is doing similar things that what Bitcoin is doing, and that is we throw out a number. We can put it out, in front of everybody. We can make it into a QR code, and it's worthless for anybody except one individual, that merchant, specifically, perhaps at a specific time, and for a specific circumstance, and then it's worthless. Tokenization has been around just as long as NFC and these other types of technologies. If Visa and MasterCard do what I am pretty certain they're going to do, we're going to see a rapid change. There are going to be financial incentives for merchants to upgrade their equipment. I have merchants that I knew from the late 1980s that are using a device called the Verifone Trans 330. It's based on a Zilog Z80 processor in the late 70s, literally. And thing still operates, still runs. It is quote unquote not PCI compliant. but it is because it doesn't do anything dangerous to the card. And these merchants are swiping and using these terminals for decades, and they have no incentive to leave that device. They get the phone call 30 a day about some new, iPad-based POS system and a new way to pay, new cash register, and they won't move because there's no incentive. But when Visa goes to these merchants and says, listen, not that you have to, but if you accept this new equipment system, you're going to have a reduction in your cost structure. That's going to dramatically change the state of technology and payments in the U.S.
Well, I was looking at this company called Loop, and they made a pretty cool system, which is basically you have this little antenna kind of a thing that gets attached to the phone.
Yeah, I know the founders.
And you load your cards onto it. But the unique thing about Loop is it's using electromagnetic low, radiation. It is NFC for all practical purposes, and you go to any standard POS a swipe terminal, and you pay. So you're not swiping; you're just bringing your phone close to it, and it mimics the data that needs to go across via the antenna and what have you. Now, something like this, I'm just surprised is not making waves in the U.S. And
it
one
is
of the reasons
it is, but it's in the background. It's
okay. I am very limited information on this thing, but something like this has a potential unheard of in the developing world. Why? Because so much is invested in a POS terminal. That replacing it, the banks and the people who are funding it have an ROI of 4 years or 3 years or 5 years. They're not going to be replacing it anytime soon. In the US, the POS terminals are pretty advanced. You can tap into it. They have web services. They operate on the internet, et cetera, et cetera. But in the developing emerging markets, this solution, Loop, can just do wonders to the existing mobile infrastructure, the mobile payments, and say, well, you don't need to change your merchant setup. Just go bring it, tap it, and that's it. Are they looking outside the U.S.? I think they are. I'm not too sure, but
I've actually had a Loop for almost 9 months. It was pretty ugly, the prototype that I was using, and I can tell you that it was initially something that I had some trepidation about. Now I know George and Grayson and all the guys that put this together. One of the gentlemen started the terminal manufacturer Hypercom, and sold that off years ago. And these people have been around for a while. And as soon as first off, it's using magnetics. What it is essentially, why it's called a loop, is it uses an inductive loop to simulate what is going on when you swipe a credit card through essentially a magnetic head, a tape reading head. It's a genius design, something that actually many of us in the industry have played with for quite a long time. It's not necessarily new. Some aspects of it is patented, and good for them. So when I started experimenting with it, I expected a lot of trepidation from merchants because, first off, it didn't look like a product. It looked like somebody's hobby. And they were delighted by it. They were really delighted because when you hold the Loop device to a credit card terminal, it activates as if you swipe the card, but it happens faster because you're not doing the mechanical motion. So you hold it, boom, it beeps most of the time, and then the transaction amount is registered. Merchants scratching their head. How did you do that? It's magical. In fact, at one time, we were playing around with it at a relatively known Silicon Valley restaurant with actually executives from payment companies all around us. And I had it in my sleeve, and I said, I'm going to telepathically send my credit card to your POS terminal. Boom, it popped up. And there were 3 credit card startup payment executives standing right there, and they were just scratching their head. What just happened?
Probably.
I go, it's not pay with your name, it's pay with your mind.
Right. I met a certain someone, don't want to name them, but they're from the reverse engineering companies they have in China. And one of the things he was asking me about is, well, Can you tell me exactly how it works? Because I'm really interested to know. They understand the concept. I think it's just a matter of time that the loop would also be copied, and then you'd be seeing it on Alibaba or something like that.
Yes. There is that chance. There's some uniqueness about it. They worked out a lot of the stumbling blocks. Here's what's interesting. This technology could have been used by a lot of startups. It actually, and I will take some credit, it was actually shown to a number of payment startups, and they shunned it. They walked away from it. But here's the really interesting part. When it was delivered to one of my very good friends inside of let's call it a computer and cell phone company.
Go ahead and tell us.
They immediately looked at it and said, how much energy will this drain from the battery? And I did a quick calculation, and how much more miniaturized can we make it? I go, I could make this the size of a dime, and the energy drain would be, negligible. I don't want to tell you how many watts and et cetera, amperes. But at the end of the day, they just looked at it and said, why wouldn't we build this into our phone? And why would we allow somebody else to get access to this technology? So at the end of the day, and I don't want to say that anything is hard in stone at this point, at the end of the day, I will guarantee you that this time next year, you will see this technology built into handsets.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if Huawei or Samsung were to, take the leap on that.
I don't joke when I say that optics, magnetics, sonics, NFC, BLE, iBeacons, all of these technologies are going to converge. And there's at least one company that's smart enough to see this convergence. And instead of politically playing games with NFC, a lot of people on Sand Hill Road going all the way to startups have a political football with NFC because they have sort of painted that. They painted it as a carrier solution like ISIS. It isn't. It's a card-based solution. NFC is going to be built into most of the credit cards in the United States by the end of 2016. So it's not about whether ISIS and the carriers are going to win. It's going to be in the credit card. So it is going to be a technology that we have a choice. Do we want to sit there and put a card into a machine and type our PIN, or do we want to hold the card over a machine and walk away? I think most people can use it.
It's the same analogy of that all-in-one printer, and it's the same analogy. I was talking to this guy. He's an expert in mobile devices and so forth in Europe, and he said, it was a matter of time before the email app was. A matter of time that the camera had to come on the phone. It was a matter of time that third-party apps or third-party add-ons were absolutely native on the phone, and it's only a matter of time that payment apps and payment accessories would be native on the phone.
Let's take one step back for a quick second, and let's just define which the words that we're using. So when we say mobile wallets versus mobile payments versus mobile banking or mobile commerce, is there a different way that you think people look at these words and sort of see representations of companies or implementations as far as a user experience? How do you guys each define mobile wallets, mobile payments, and mobile banking?
Well, you can go first there.
Okay, so mobile wallet is nothing more than a layer in between the phone and the bank account that you have, except that you never really went to the bank to open an account. It's now somehow sitting somewhere in the middle layer, floating layer, and that's where your money is. So you have this wallet concept that it's just like you carry a wallet with you. You're not actually carrying or hauling the entire bank with you. It's your phone, and that's where the money is. And mobile payments to me is something that you can very seamlessly send payments from your mobile to any of the touch points that you would usually do, be a bank, be a POS machine, be a person, or be another wallet.
See, I see all these things converging. It's just the same thing I talk about with payments. There's going to be no distinction between person to person and commercial payments. They're all merging. There's just degrees, shades of gray. The mobile wallet or the financial app, mobile banking, they're all going to merge into one sense. And it was brilliant what Faisal was saying about the manifest destiny of the phone producer, or in this, let's call it Apple in this case. What they're going to do is they're going to look at different apps and they're going to say, well, we're going to integrate that into the ISO. They're going to look at, into the iOS. When they look at it from a hardware perspective, they're going to say, I see these external things going on. I'm going to implement it inside the hardware. And it's pretty easy to predict where these things are going to go. I've been a reader of patents since the 1980s, and I've been a specialist of patents for Apple for decades. And it's no accident that Apple has the largest number of NFC patents in the world.
Really, I didn't know that.
Yes, and they don't stop. This wasn't something that was a treasure trove from the 1990s. They recently filed an NFC-based patent just 2 months ago. They've invested millions of man-hours of research in near-field communications. So I sit down with people who are in the payments industry and who are biased by the Kool-Aid that's being spread around and saying NFC is a carrier problem, chasing a solution it doesn't need to be solved, all these types of things, saying, listen, that's the same reason you said that the fingerprint scanner wasn't going to be put on an iPhone. It's the same reason you said that Apple wasn't going to get into payments. Now I think it's abundantly clear. You got to remember, when I started talking about this back in mid-2000s, everybody said Apple will never be in payments or will look like iTunes or something. I said they're going to first put a fingerprint scanner on a phone. And I remember 2008 sitting there telling people this, and they said, you're insane. The technology stinks. There's no reason for it. And I said, why are they filing hundreds of patents for security and fingerprint? Oh, these big companies, they just file patents just because. And I go, no. That's not what Apple does. That might be what some companies like IBM does or something, but the company generally files patents in a general direction of where they're moving.
So is this going to be the next big thing? Realistically, Apple hasn't come out with a major innovation, since, you had the iPhone, then you had the iPad, but they haven't done anything in a few years. Is this the next big? Yeah, the iWallet is the passbook. Is this the next big thing that they're betting the company on?
Well, not just that. They're going to be betting the company on telemetry of your human body. The medical, biomedical, wearable technologies, whatever buzzword you want to use. They're definitely going that direction. That's going to be one of their killer apps. The other killer app is going to be payments. They are working diligently to make iBeacons a massive solution. If you look at baseball, you look at basketball now. These stadiums are being fitted with iBeacon technology, and there's so many startups that are just misreading what this all means. They look at it like a location-based system, which is, I don't want to. Let's just call it kindergarten. That's not even really what iBeacons are about. They do location. They're highly localized information, but it's going to be part of a much larger picture. And if you want to see the bigger picture, you look at their patent filings. You look at the fact that Apple has the vision to understand the different distances that we interplay within all of the spaces that we occupy. Some are very close, some are very far. Some are going to need magnetics, some are going to need optics, some are going to need sonics, some are going to need...
I think a friend of mine said, LBS, location-based services, was 1.0. Then we had LBS 2.0, which we sort of skipped, and we don't even know how to define it. And all these iBeacons, etc., near-field technologies for payments meshed with LBS is what web or mobile 3.0 is all about.
Absolutely, and I think Apple is going to be leading this campaign. Now, does that mean that there's no opportunity for startups? It means that they are creating the infrastructure that are going to create billion-dollar startups. The problem is...
That's a huge point.
It is there. See, the problem is everybody's got to build their infrastructure. I'm Mr. Merchant. I'm gonna give you this little, iPod, and I'm gonna have or iPad, and I'm gonna have you read somebody's QR code, and that whole world is gonna be gone. or somebody inventing a new payment system, will pay with your name, or all those concepts are gone. So the investments that those companies made in those technologies are going to be wasted because Apple's going to build the infrastructure that's going to be deeply integrated within iOS.
So
now, if you knew this in 2008, if you were a payments company in 2008, you came to me and we sat down, I would say, great idea. This wallet's beautiful. It's great. It will never work long term because your landowner, Apple, is going to take back the rental property that they've given you for your wallet. They're going to not maybe renege your lease, so that's going to make it very hard for you to occupy that space. And that's what's going to happen with most wallets in the United States on iOS devices. Apple's going to build the infrastructure.
Let me ask you this. I mean, that's you're essentially you're carving out a potential way the world plays out. You're right. You're predicting one way that this could happen, and that sounds like a very logical way, but it may not be the only way. So let me ask you guys both a few possible trajectories for mobile payments. Right. In scenario one, you have, say, independent provider. You tell me which you think is most logical and how it splits up. But you have independent providers experimenting with limited services in specific geographic markets. Right. And that's sort of how things are happening now. And that's going to continue to happen to where geographic markets divide up the offerings that are available. In scenario two, and of course there's going to be some mix, but scenario two, you have the fly solo model, which is where one visionary player with significant market power makes the required investment that stimulates the development. So this is where you have, if PayPal or Square or Apple or ISIS and whoever can come in and just essentially revolutionize everything across the board. And in the third scenario, you have this buddy system, we'll call it, where a financial institution and a carrier come together to provide payment solutions. They share the risks, they share the rewards, and they develop a system that together they build something on a broad base with a coalition with smaller players. And sort of the last option I could see playing out is this Apple model that you're describing, or something similar, Brian, to where you have this open federation, right? And in this scenario, you have mobile payment carriers, financial institutions, merchants, even the chip makers, the application providers, all these guys, and they come together on this standardized platform. And that the standardized platform provides the portfolio of payment services to various merchants across the world. I know it's sort of a lot to imagine how the lines cross, but I think it's important to divide up the four, as I see it, 3 or 4 different potential ways that everything can play out, because Apple's going to make a big ripple, right? And when they do, it affects all the other smaller guys. If it takes Apple another 10 years for them to create this platform, then a lot of startups will happen and evolve and get bought and acquired in the meantime. I mean, just a quick one is M-Foundry was purchased. They're the largest mobile banking startup, or were startup, and they were purchased for $150 million, and they developed all the early stage and a lot of the larger Citibank and Bank of America and many other banks, their mobile banking solutions. So I think without that infrastructure, without Apple there yet, there's going to be a lot of startups being bought and creating value, but it's still not, like what you said, Brian, it's still not a perfect system.
Well, it's interesting you bring up M-Foundry, and let's start with the Apple thing and move through this. M-Foundry, Benjamin Weiger was one of their chief designers. Guess where he wound up? He wound up at Starbucks. What did he help invent? The most successful wallet in the United States, the Starbucks wallet app. And where is he now? He's head of retail payments at Apple. And how long has he been there? For almost 3 years. What is Benjamin's background?
I remember.
Benjamin, when he moved to Apple, was a fairly big deal, but he hasn't, surfaced for quite a while. But
we should get Benjamin on the show to tell us all the answers what Apple's going to do.
I don't think you're going to get Benjamin on the phone. He's a very, very interesting individual and very knowledgeable. What did Benjamin do? He did a lot of NFC work, by the way, that within M-Foundry, but he moved to optics when it came to Starbucks, and that wasn't an accident. He was very practical and pragmatic. He looked at the world, said, what do I have? What am I dealing with? And he was struggling between Sonics and optics. And obviously, they took the track of doing it was fail-safe. Basically they looked at thousands of screens. They looked at the convergence of smartphones in the U.S. and they said, we don't need to go Sonics, and we can go optics, but we're going to put all the intelligence on the POS side. All the screen needs to be is a dumb reproduction of a 2D barcode. And now he's at Apple. And he's got a convergence of Sonics, optics, and NFC background. And we see them still making patents in this area. And we're looking at iBeacons and all this. Now, when iOS builds the infrastructure, it to me, as a developer, as somebody who programs, why would I want to go and program something outside of that infrastructure? Apple's not saying, I want to be the merchant service provider. They will not do merchant service providing. If you look at every other payment startup, they want to do both sides of the transaction. It'll be wallet. I want to be a merchant service provider. I want to struggle to make mills of pennies on a merchant service side and perhaps lose money on every transaction. And I also want to be a wallet provider. Apple knows the folly of being on the merchant service side. And they said, we don't want anything to do with it. We don't want to create our own currency. We don't want to do any of that. We want to be a facilitator, because that's what we do with record labels. We could become a record label, but now we're a facilitator. That was Steve Jobs' vision. We can become a phone cellular provider, but we're a facilitator for AT&T and Verizon. So they understand the facilitator role, and they know how powerful it is. And they know about making a platform for creativity and development. And that's why I say it's going to create billion-dollar industries around this wallet infrastructure. And it's and calling it a wallet is really not the proper term. It's going to be much more pervasive. It's going to be an entire infrastructure that will facilitate payments in a way that we've never seen before. The convergences are taking place rapidly, almost as if Apple put this queue out there. The movement to EMV, the movement to NFC, the movement to tokenization, all these things happened in the last 6-8 months. And the tokenization aspect cannot be underplayed. It was exactly the direction Apple was hoping for. So now we have, a major reference platform moving in this direction. What's going to happen with the Android reference platform? They're going to have to catch up. There's some significant patents that Apple holds in a number of these use cases. The surprising patent will be based on NFC, and it will be remarkable how they use it. There's a number of surprising patents on how they're going to be using optics.
So tell me, Brian, if I'm a startup founder, I'm experimenting with and trying to learn about the space here. If I grew up in the States, I don't know too much about international payments, but I'm fully ambitious, fully willing to travel and learn and seek that knowledge that I can gain to build something valuable. What should I do now? What do you think a lot of the early entrepreneurs that are researching the space should either become experts in or start to build now that would help them?
Really good question. And I spend a lot of time with people in this exact same mode. And I do this with any payments company, a legacy payment company and a startup payment company. They better understand this very rapidly. This is going to be the most massive pivot you're going to see if they're going to survive. And unfortunately, you're going to see billion-dollar investments just scrapped. Hundreds and hundreds, thousands of man hours in building these things. It is. And the thing is, it didn't have to be this way. I'm not going to pound that drum much longer, but it's heartbreaking because I sat there and I said, guys, don't you understand that you're just on somebody else's land here? This is going to be an integrated function with iOS. No, it isn't. It will never be that way. And I understand that, but I mean, isn't it easier to understand the lay of the land rather than trying to get a bulldozer when you don't have the rights to get a bulldozer? So now we have the lay of the land. What do you do? Study the patents. What I would tell any founder, get remedial and study Apple patents. See how they apply to payments. See how they apply to key systems, unlocking and locking doors, ticketing systems, points systems, reward systems. These are all very important patents. They sound esoteric, but wait until you see how they use them. The patents aren't always obvious. You need to be a creative thinker. And this is where your creativity can work. Okay, so you weave in and out of this infrastructure that Apple is building, and you build on this infrastructure, high-rise buildings you can build on this. Apple doesn't, Apple's giving everybody a favor by not wanting to own aspects of this. But, you can already see the rapid development. You can see that ticketing agencies, people who are responsible for getting a lot of people into a big facility and locating them, they've already adopted iBeacons. It's a done deal, Now it's the idea of like, how as an entrepreneur can I use that? Once I know that there are iBeacons everywhere, do you want to go and be a tool maker? Sure, you can go out there and make iBeacons, fine. You're going to compete with Apple at some point. Do I want to write unique software on it? Yeah, you could, but shouldn't it be, more in your interest to try to see what Apple's going to do natively inside of iOS? So start studying those things and understand that the wallet functionality within an iOS device or an Android device is ultimately going to be in the hands of the company that controls that software. That's a given. It's not really, in the United States, it's not going to be in the hands of the carrier. It's not going to be in the hands of the bank. It's going to primarily, to begin with, it's going to be in the hands of Apple and iOS. And it'll be such a beautiful experience, from the fingerprint sensor to iBeacons to optics, sonics, magnetics, BLE. All of these things are going to be so well done that we're going to say, well, why doesn't everybody do this? This is the reason for its existence. And surprisingly, we'll probably see Apple support algorithmic currencies in a way that nobody could have predicted. A lot of people are reading what Apple's doing in unfortunately, a very short-term basis. I think in some ways they're doing people a favor by not allowing some of these coin-based wallets on an iOS device. And I can't go into very intimate details about it, but let's see what a year or two looks like, and I think we'll be surprised. So as a founder of a startup that wants to be in payments, understand, just like we talked about leapfrogging technology, are we laying cable down in parts of the Gobi Desert to get new populations to get phone service? No, we're putting wireless service out there. So should you be sitting there and trying to invent a new wallet and all these other things? No. Leapfrog that and go into something where you can really solve a problem. Look at the problem that a merchant has. If first off, the consumer doesn't have a problem to solve with a wallet, unfortunately, at this point. If you're going to tell me that they want to carry one less credit card or it's not fast enough, that's not going to really work. 2 years from now, when everybody's forced to use EMV because of security reasons at retail, then you may have some friction points that you need to address. If you're wise, you would start addressing those today. Instead of saying it's not going to happen, it's not going to come to the U.S., again, look at the landowners. Visa and MasterCard said it's going to happen. We're going to force it to happen. We're going to create financial disincentives to a merchant not to participate in this. Now, I think the other way is they're going to give bonuses for merchants that do this correctly. So, there's friction points there. But you take a step back. What are the real problems that merchants are facing? It isn't that they don't know their customer. It isn't that they don't know how many cappuccinos they sold on rainy days versus non-rainy days. It isn't the fact that certain types of people are bigger tippers or smaller tippers. Please don't waste our time with that data, because most merchants don't care. Us nerds do. It's an interesting bit of trivia. But if you go to those merchants and say you just discovered that in their business, they'll shake their head and they'll go on to do something else. It won't really play material into their business.
I'll say something over here. That's the exact opposite outside the U.S. The merchants are not independent enough to make that decision. They are being driven, they are being financed by the payment instruments and the banking institutions to keep their equipment that is prevalent in their society on which transactions can be done. Cards and payments is a very famous expo that happens over here, and been going there for 2 years, going there next month again. And one of the things you'll see is that there's a lot of payment solutions out there, and most of them are somehow looking at addressing the question. And the question is, how can we get more merchant adoption from these payment systems? NFC, phone-based, partial hybrids solutions, what have you. And to come to a question that earlier that Mike had asked, what do we see? In this part of the world, the carrier is out, definitely. Do we expect to see lead, follow, get out of the way, with Apple being at the forefront? Most likely not. And I'm talking about the emerging markets. Sure, they'll take some good points from Apple's patents or what have you, but is Apple's technology going to rule here? Not at all. I think it's going to be a lot of independent vendors who will team up with the banks and financial institutions and then convince them that they can put up a distribution network for that payment system to come into play so that transactions on their solution can be dominant. It's easier said than done. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of really excellent products out there. But to be dominant, and I mean dominant on a scale of India where you say, I have 400,000 merchants accepting my MasterCard PayPass, that's a huge investment. And I don't think any startup can do that. I think it has to be in emerging markets. It's definitely going to be, the big names coming behind them, Visa, MasterCard, or other players teaming up with banks.
I got a question. You said in India, a PayPass adoption is pretty high. Is that what I'm hearing?
It's very, very, very
interesting.
Low.
Oh, very low.
I mean,
very low.
Oh, no, almost zero.
Okay.
Almost. But for it to be high, the investment is so mammoth. Who's going to foot the bill? The merchant is not going to do it. Merchant is already financed by the bank to go, and because the banks own the acquiring networks. There are very, very few individual players who actually own acquiring networks. And if they do, to the best of my knowledge, they're small percentages, 10, 12, 15%, no more. But most of the acquiring networks in the merchant space are owned by banks. So the banks have to make this, a very, it's almost like a gamble and make a decision. Well, do we go with technology A or B? And then they have to see, well, okay, even if we go with either one, how do we roll it out at 25,000 points of locations? How do we roll it out? How do we finance it? How do we get the adoption rate? The consumers are always complaining, well, I have my wallet. Guess what? I cannot pay at McDonald's with that. I can't pay at my local shoe store with that. So what's the use of having the wallet? So the old age notion of build it and they will come still holds true to this day in this part of the world. But who is going to build it? That is clearly the banks. The banks are in this part of the world. Mike, to answer your question, it's going to be the banks that will work with independent software vendors or financial services companies or companies that have a payment solution. Brand it, and roll it out. They are the ones who are going to be driving the ecosystems.
And what do you think? We've only got a few minutes left here, so maybe I'll ask this question for the way out. And Faisal, if you want to give your input first. But I've thought about this a lot, and I wonder, what do you think the biggest resistance is to growth and sort of innovation in the space across the world? Is it the knowledge of either founders or banking executives, the people who are going to be instrumenting the solutions for the future? Is it the technical ability to build those solutions? Is it the funding? Maybe the banks wouldn't have this problem, but is it the independent guys we talked about earlier, the entrepreneurs in Israel and Iceland and all over the world? Or is it the funding for them to grow it, or is it lastly the distribution to get their product out there? Working with ISOs and et cetera.
I think 1, 2, and 3 is not even part of the equation. I think so. Everyone is very cognizant of what's out there in the world, be it in their local markets, regional markets, US, Europe, what have you. They're very, very cognizant. Are you talking about, is talent available? Absolutely, talent is available. Is it distribution? Sure, distribution comes into play. But the main thing is, at the end of the day, when you have decided upon a product, whatever it may be, choice X or choice Y, doesn't matter. It's that risk that you look at. What if this thing doesn't roll out? So the banks play a very conservative game. They look at anchor clients. They look at low-hanging fruit. They see the adoption over there. They see the acceptability over there. They see the transaction volumes over there. Once it's good, they roll it out even more and more and more. Traditionally, the distribution space, and this is very important you understand that, traditionally the distribution space right now is owned by the mobile carriers. You have thousands upon thousands of shops, retailers, individual points of presence, small, huge stores, small shops, what have you, that will provide mobile top-up facility. Now, when you look at a carrier that has, let's say, 250,000 points of presence, how do you compete against that when you're trying to throw the carrier out and not make the carrier part of the equation? The only option is you roll out your own distribution network. And that, my friend, is a big issue. So banks are trying to roll out their own banking infrastructure with their branchless banking networks and so forth. But at the end of the day, it does come down to, it's that risk. Do I need to really invest so much and put all that money out? And what if it won't work?
Wow, that's interesting. And Brian, what do you think for the States? I mean, in terms of it seems like we don't have a funding problem here in the States. Is it a knowledge of the industry? Is it the distribution to get products out there, mobile products out there? What do you think?
Well, funding is definitely not a problem. Even today, somebody with a great payment idea can definitely get funding. It is really knowledge about the space. I call it the knowledge of the practical and pragmatic merchant. And I'm sure, Mike, you know this personally from FlowTab and the POS experience. It's one thing to invent something and create something from an engineering perspective and technologist perspective. It's another thing to convince that merchant to try your service and unfortunately to like or love your service. Yeah. The reason why things are the way they are is because they are the way they are. I mean, and I learned this the hard way. A lot of people say, well, you're just anti-technology. I'm a technologist, but I'm also, served notice by these merchants since the mid-'80s. I've worked with them on a daily basis, and they've trained me on how they think. And it's contrary to what we see almost everywhere else. Unless you've actually been with merchants for any period of time, your assumptions are absolutely wrong. They do not make decisions in the way a typical Harvard business class would train you that they make decisions. So now we look at the cash register. 95% of American small businesses, not medium, small businesses are using a cash register that's about $90 to $100. And it's based on technology that's been around since the 1970s. They're sophisticated calculators. As technologists, we're appalled by this. We look at it and say they need to upgrade. And the coolest upgrade is to make an iPad into a cash register, and that'll solve their problems. Well, first off, what problem are you trying to solve? Is it adding up numbers? It works. Is it because it's just not aesthetically beautiful? Take a look around the store. Go around and drive around this country and look at the store. Is the store aesthetically pleasing to you to begin with, to your standards? A lot of people making these claims, yes, they might have incredible taste, and yes, they may make beautiful devices, but what's this aesthetic? Is it only in the Bay Area or swanky shops in Beverly Hills where you have this counter that's cleared of everything and you just have this lonely cash register? Well, I'm sorry. 99.99% of merchants I visit, their counters are loaded. You want to know what it's loaded with? Something that will make them money. The counters are cluttered because they will constantly be putting more and more things up there so that people might buy them. So this whole idea of this clear counter, open space, which you see so many startup founders doing, I'm not putting them down.
It sounds nice because they're coming from the Apple perspective where they don't need paper. At my desk, I don't have anything but a wireless keyboard, a wireless mouse, and a monitor.
That's beautiful.
So, that's beautiful for my work environment. But
that's not how the rest of the world operates. And either you accept, you could go out there and say, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm going to change the world. That's fine. Now, And I've had conversations, directly and indirectly with guys like Steve Jobs and stuff, and they're like, how are people going to use their computer? Well, I remember the very first Mac 1, right, and had no fan. And I knew a lot of people who felt that it was getting too hot, so they attached a fan inside the handle, and a little box fan, and cut holes into the case, and it would just. And this was taking place in Apple. I walked into Apple campus and saw this, and this 80s. And it would drive Steve insane because he designed the computer so that nobody would do that. He wanted it to be as quiet as possible. Now, obviously, if you're using Steve as a model to try to be the next great entrepreneur, it may make sense to do that. But if you look at how a lot of people use products that he created, they didn't necessarily use them in the way that he had thought. For example, the desktop. It used to really make him so upset that people would just clutter their desktop. I'm one of them. You know, if he was around to see my desktop on a OS 10 device, it's loaded with files.
Yeah,
but it's logical to me. It makes sense. I know where to find things. I do use search a lot, but I still like knowing physically in my mind where I know something is on my desktop I'm going to use. So,
Brian, I'd say the other thing too, I think what I've realized is that people, founders tend to not look at, they tend to have technical ability, the ability to get funding, maybe even the knowledge of their particular problem that they're solving, right? They don't necessarily have knowledge of, domain experience. They don't necessarily know what the whole,
that's the word.
Yeah, the whole industry looks like, nor do they need to at that stage. But you need to solve the very specific problem that you're addressing. But I think what a lot of founders make mistakes doing is they don't address the unit economics and the unit problems, right? So,
yes.
You have companies that get a lot of funding and they're addressing a very macro problem, or, they're building a solution, you could say. And, Klinkle just comes right to mind with the technology of the sound, the high frequency sound to recognize when you're in the
Sure.
building. But are you solving that on a unit economic level? And what I mean by that is, can you get it to work with 10 people, right? Can you get 10, we experienced it in the bar and nightlife industry with FlowTab, and the apparel was our specific vertical at Zing. And we said, could we get, 10 merchants, 10 people that loved it, sort of have a small fire, as we'd always say.
Sure.
And once you have a small fire, you can always pour on more. You can go and get distribution. You can go get funding. Yeah. But I think that's, to me, that from my experience, that's the biggest lack or mistake of founders is spreading too broad.
Yeah, so you build a product with this vision in mind that you're going to release the clutter from all these merchants' desktops and selling spaces, and you're approaching a solution that doesn't have a problem. In fact, I went to a Whole Foods market. And I knew about this since December before Square announced their register being used at a couple of the areas within Whole Foods. And, the premise was they were going to clear their counter. Well, the counter is actually more complex now because not only do they have the existing POS system, which they're not removing. A lot of people don't recognize this. Most of the places I visited, and I have 4 of them now, they're not removing the existing POS. It's staying there. And they're just putting a square, square stand in front of it. So it's now even a more complex space, even more driven. But even if they were to remove the POS system, immediately point of purchase impulse items would be taking over the space that it cleared up. So it would be just as cluttered. So if you start from the premise, I'm going to declutter your space, wrong. So if you're going to start from I'm solving the problem, I can add numbers up quicker, wrong. If you're going to start from the premise of inventory management, unfortunately wrong. About 65% of U.S. small businesses do not do inventory management at all. Their inventory management is a piece of paper that they got from a distributor.
Look around the store.
Yeah.
All right.
So again, and I'll jump into something kind of a tangential to this. How do we jump into a new realm of technology? And Faisal was talking about this in his part of the world in the U.S. If Apple is even partly successful with implementing iBeacons and the way they integrate that within iOS and to make it such an incredible experience. And if they do what they've done with Passive was a company that they acquired that had no battery required for BLE devices. So these devices will live out there forever. They will constantly recharge just by having signals in the space around them, cellular, Wi-Fi. If that is going to take place, and these are deployed everywhere, even in developing nations, you will see technology because it would be so integrated within the operating system, so much of a pleasant experience for the consumer on how it will present itself in these new notification systems.
It is the future.
Yeah.
All right, we've got to wrap up. Brian, Faisal,
Wonderful.
This is a great podcast. We'll have this up in a week, and look forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
And look forward for next week as well.
You guys take care.
All right, guys.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.